Welcome back, everybody. I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. Before getting started, I want to apologize for the prolonged absence from the show. It was definitely a longer break than I anticipated. Once I fell out of my routine, it became really difficult for me to get back into making new episodes, and the more time that passed, the more daunting it felt. It didn't help that I had also planned to change up how I make these episodes. And long story short, after trying out a few iterations and recording some test episodes, I realized the changes I'd wanted to make didn't turn out as I had envisioned, and that I preferred what I had been doing all along. So, for better or worse, let's pick up where we left off back in 1967. For those just joining the show, this is a series where we talk about the research on psilocybin, the psychedelic prodrug found in magic mushrooms. We'll be breaking down and discussing the scientific literature, one study at a time, from past to present. Today's episode is on the article titled A Heuristic Model of Creativity, published in 1967 by researchers at Ohio State University. We've actually talked about these researchers on two prior episodes, Episode 32 and Episode 35. Since the studies we talked about in those prior episodes are actually cited in the introduction section of today's article, it's worth it to do a brief recap. In Episode 32, we talked about a study that wanted to examine whether or not psilocybin produced any changes to participants' taste perception, and more precisely their taste acuity, or their sensitivity to being able to detect certain tastes. Although the study was wrought with a number of methodological issues, the key takeaway that's relevant to today's topic is that some of their data did suggest that after participants were given psilocybin, they were better able to discriminate between solutions of varying sweetness, i.e., they appeared to have an increased taste sensitivity. In Episode 35, we discussed two studies, both of which examined how psilocybin induces a slowed perception of time. As I mentioned during that episode, these studies were some of the least rigorous experiments I have ever come across, and the manuscripts were also missing a ton of information. Fortunately, although those studies weren't very informative, we do know from much better research, and even just from a lot of personal experience, that psilocybin does in fact tend to slow down our perception of time. In addition to citing in their introduction these studies that we discussed in Episode 32 and 35, they also cite another study they conducted examining how psilocybin influences an individual's sensitivity to light. Reportedly, they claim that psilocybin increased participants' sensitivity to light by 50 to 70%. Now, the reason why we haven't gone over that study in a prior episode is because it looks like it was never actually published. This finding comes from a study that, according to their own references, they had only submitted for publication, but it was still pending acceptance to the journal they had submitted it to. This is a red flag, in my opinion. Occasionally, researchers might reference a study that has been accepted for publication but hasn't officially been published yet, in which case it's called in press. Rarely, though, have I seen researchers cite a paper that has merely been submitted, but has yet to receive final approval. Since it looks like the paper never got published, this likely means that the paper was rejected by the journal after failing the peer review process. Without having any way to access the paper that they cited, there's no way to evaluate their claim about light sensitivity, so it may as well be stricken from the record. But I digress. The way these prior studies tie in to our topic for today is that in today's article, the researchers wanted to continue their examination of how psilocybin seems to enhance, or at least increase the sensitivity of, some of our perceptions. The way the authors sort of phrase it is that psilocybin increases our sensory output based on the same or reduced amount of sensory input. Take, for example, the study on taste perception. They found that participants were still able to detect or perceive changes in sweetness of various solutions, which is the output, even as they reduced the amount of sweetener added, which is the input. When it comes to today's study, rather than examine our taste perception or our perception of time, they instead chose to examine one aspect of our visual perception. In particular, they wanted to see if they could produce what they called directed hallucinations. Directed hallucinations were defined by the researchers as a visual recall of past experience, specifically in the form of symbols and patterns. To induce this, they essentially showed participants partially deleted printed text, where the top portion of each letter was removed, in hopes that participants might still be able to read the text as normal. They hypothesized that under the influence of psilocybin, quote, such partially deleted texts would constitute a sufficient stimulus pattern to be read at least to some extent. Although that's the key assessment, let's actually go through the methods in more detail. First, the researchers recruited 17 college students for the study. These were all unpaid volunteers, and although they don't provide any additional information as far as participant demographics, based on prior research we've come across, I believe it's likely that these students were white and male. Unfortunately, a lot of past research we've seen have used an abundance of white males whenever the studies are ethical or at least low risk, and have used predominantly black males whenever the studies are unethical or high risk. After they recruited their participants, they then actually had a preliminary psilocybin session meant only to familiarize participants with the effects of the drug. According to the researchers, the volunteers were, quote, exposed to 10 to 12 milligrams of psilocybin in a supportive, non-laboratory home environment. This occurred 2 to 4 weeks prior to the actual experiment. On the surface, I actually like the idea behind this preliminary exposure session. Although they don't justify it in the paper, I imagine the participants may have never had experience with psilocybin previously, and thus they wanted to familiarize the participants so that when they came in to do the experiment, the overall experience wouldn't be too overwhelming or distracting, allowing them to better focus on the task they were given. That said, it does seem at the very least a bit unprofessional to conduct these sessions in a home environment, and they never specify whether this was done at the home of the participants themselves or the home of the researchers. Although I understand this choice may have been made to maximize the comfort of participants, you can make very comfortable and therapeutic lab environments that are conducive to positive psychedelic experiences. That's what they're doing right now at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London as we speak. In addition to it being more professional to have these sessions at the lab, I actually think it has the added benefit of exposing participants not just to the drug, but also to the setting they will be in for the final experiment. We know that setting is a vitally important factor when it comes to influencing our experience of psychedelics, so I think it would have been helpful to get participants familiar with both psilocybin as well as the context of the lab setting. Anyway, as I mentioned, 2 to 4 weeks after this initial exposure session, they then brought the participants into the lab and conducted the primary experiment, which was broken into a pre-drug test and a post-drug test. For the pre-test, prior to being given psilocybin, participants were asked to read 2 paragraphs of text. The first was simply a standard paragraph of text that was undeleted, which they labeled as text A. The second was actually the same exact text that was part of text A, but this time the top 43% of each letter had been deleted. They labeled this as text B. They then calculated the percent of words participants were correctly able to read from text A and B. Fortunately, they do include an example of text A and B to see both the content of the paragraph as well as what the deleted text looks like. I'll post the figures on the podcast's Instagram and on the website so you can see it, but I'll also read an excerpt from text A so you can get a sense for what the text was like. So that we can think of an alpha particle as held to the rest of the nucleus much as a single molecule is held in a drop of liquid. But if it gets a short step away, the attractive forces become ineffective and it then flies off, repelled by the electric forces. Now, if we were trying to account for the behavior in terms of classical dynamics, we should say that the emission of an alpha particle is like the evaporation of a molecule from the liquid. I think the reason they chose this type of text is that it's rather difficult to quickly memorize and regurgitate, unless I suppose you're really passionate about this area of physics. After the pre-test, they then gave participants 10 to 12 milligrams of psilocybin and waited for 90 minutes. They chose to wait 90 minutes because, as we have seen on prior episodes, this tends to be about when you reach the peak of a psilocybin experience. At 90 minutes post-administration, they then conducted the second reading test. Similar to the pre-test, they first have participants read a normal paragraph of undeleted text, although this time a different paragraph than the one they read previously. They still, however, labeled this as text A. They then had participants read the same paragraph, but again with the top 43% of each letter having been removed, which they also labeled text B. Finally, taking it one step further than they did during the pre-test, they next had participants read the same paragraph again, but this time with the top 74% of each letter deleted, which they labeled as text C. The percent of words participants were correctly able to read were calculated for all three texts. Before even getting into the results, I have two issues I want to bring up with the procedure. First, because they only had text C as part of the post-test, but not the pre-test, there's no way to compare how psilocybin may influence performance of reading text C. This seems like a very obvious oversight. The other issue I have is that I wish they included a condition where some participants only read text B and C without ever seeing the undeleted version. Although I understand that their aim was to trigger so-called directed hallucinations, which were defined as a recall of past experience, I think it would have been interesting to try and distinguish between recall of recent past experience and recall of remote past experience. What I mean is, if participants were better able to read the deleted text correctly under the influence of psilocybin, but only after first seeing the undeleted text, then that suggests whatever process is underlying the improved performance is reliant on recent memory recall, or perhaps is mediated by subconscious priming. Whereas, if participants were just as able to read the deleted text correctly under the influence of psilocybin, regardless of whether they had just seen the undeleted text or not, then that suggests whatever process is underlying the improved performance is reliant on more remote memory recall. Regardless, that's all speculation. So let's actually talk about the results at hand. Similar to my disappointment with the research presented by these researchers in episode 35, the authors again leave out so much information and barely report on their results. This is the only quantitative data that they include in this study. 4 participants were able to read up to 95% of text B and up to 42% of text C. Reportedly, they were able to read more of text B after being given psilocybin than before being given psilocybin. Unsurprisingly, the words most often read correctly by participants were those that most frequently occurred in the English language, such as the, and it, as well as a few words with particularly unique configurations of letters, possibly like classical dynamics. That's it. That is literally all of the quantitative data that they provide. It's shocking to me that this paper was accepted for publication. I don't mean to be overly harsh. It just really frustrates me to see potentially interesting research in an incredibly cool field of study fall so short. Especially when I feel like this line of research in general is stigmatized by the mainstream, and poor quality experiments don't help improve people's opinions and acceptance of psychedelic research. So overall, we can't really draw much from this study. There simply isn't the data to support their primary hypothesis. That aside, they did at least include some qualitative data that is at the very least interesting to bring up. For the 4 participants they mentioned, They noted that these individuals reported actually seeing the missing tops of the letters in text B and C. For 2 of these participants, the top portion of the letters were supposedly so vivid that they actually thought the experimenter had not deleted them properly. Based on these reports, it does ostensibly seem like the researchers were able to induce their directed hallucinations, at least in these 4 participants. The authors then go on to explain that they believe the reason for these directed hallucinations, although keeping in mind they were only present in 4 out of 17 participants, is that psilocybin may enhance our ability to form closure. Visual closure is defined as the ability to visualize a complete whole when given incomplete information or a partial picture, and is one of the visual Gestalt principles of grouping. Even when we only have missing information, we often have the ability to visualize that the bits of information are part of a complete whole, which helps produce a more consistent experience of the world. The example often used in textbooks, or at least that I've often seen in textbooks, when talking about visual closure, involves a triangle. Imagine you have an outline of a triangle on a sheet of paper, but you then decide to erase the 3 corners of the triangle, so that what you have left are just 3 disconnected edges. Even though the lines aren't connected, you still see that they form a triangle. That's an example of closure, being able to recognize a triangle when given only its disconnected edges. Imagine how disorienting the world would be if, after some object was partially occluded or blocked by another object, you suddenly thought it became 2 separate entities. Now, you might be wondering why this study is titled A Heuristic Model of Creativity. Well, the authors claim that this visual closure, the thing that again they only found in less than a quarter of participants, was evidence that psilocybin enhances creativity. They state that, quote, "The reported closure making under psilocybin may well be a model of the creative act. Human existence is closure making, i.e., creation from moment to moment through closure of the organism with their externalized environment. It is this closure making, the transformation of information to meaning, which is accelerated and enhanced under psilocybin." Now, this is a very grand statement. I do like the concept that some creative output might be thought of as the creation of a completed whole from incomplete information, and how we ourselves and our environment are bits of incomplete information that also come together to form a complete whole. That said, I don't really see how that ties into this small-scale study that had really underwhelming data. So in conclusion, given the data presented, there isn't any support for the researchers' claim that psilocybin can enhance our reading ability given partially deleted texts. Ultimately, I don't think this study adds much to our understanding of psilocybin. However, I still think it was fun to talk about. Of course, I'm biased. I do think at the very least, we got to think critically about research methods and will hopefully take away some helpful bits of information that we can continue to use when evaluating future research. Before ending the episode for today, I just want to say that I look forward to continue to make new episodes of the show. And thank you to everyone who has been listening and sharing the podcast with others, even while I went on hiatus. I don't currently have a set day that I plan to upload new episodes, but instead I'll just be uploading new episodes whenever they're finished. And with that, that's it for today's episode. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for the podcast, please let me know. You can find out all of the ways to reach me on the website, psilocybology.org, where you can also find the full transcript for each episode if interested. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.